Hello, everyone. It is Cameron back here again with some interviewing tips for multiple mini interviews or MMIs. And these are to be contrasted to traditional interviews where you would usually meet individually with a few different interviewers for maybe 15 to 30 minutes. Multiple mini interviews are usually set up where you'll meet with a panel of different people, and that will be usually individually and sequentially, and you'll meet with them for a shorter duration of time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so. Usually for these people, I actually sign a non-disclosure agreement before doing them, and so you probably won't hear very much from your friends, or you shouldn't be hearing exactly what the questions were for different schools. But nonetheless, these are an interview style that are used. My main disclosure for these is that I'm not a big fan of MMIs or multiple mini interviews. I did go on a few of them during my own interview trail when I was interviewing for medical school. The reason that I don't like them much is I know the overall goal, or one of the large goals of them, is to decrease bias by kind of spreading out and having you meet with a bunch of different interviewers. At the same time, I think that the time is very limited and the questions can be very specific. And because of this, I think it can be very hard for an applicant to really get their message across, and for an interviewer as well to really get a good feel of somebody. There's something called the elevator test, where somebody might seem normal just for the 30 seconds or so that you're in the elevator with them, but if you spoke with them for a bit longer, you might find out that their reasoning isn't so sound and that they have maybe some other issues that you weren't allowed to touch on. And so I think the MMIs can fall a little bit into this trap, which is why I'm not the biggest fan. But like I said, nonetheless, they are an interview style that is used, and so I want to touch a bit on them today. For my first slide here are some tips on approaching the prompts. The first note that I have is about carefully reading the prompt, and most times the reason that I say this is because it'll either be something that's verbally said or it might be something that's up on a slide, and you'll get an initial chance to read it. So read it carefully and make sure that you digest and try to think about what might be going on in the prompt. The second note here is probably the most important one here, which is really to take the reader through your process. And I'll go a little bit on a tangent here. I remember when I was preparing for MMIs, there was an advisor at my school, and she was saying to think back to the kind of more discussion-based classes that we had, and to think back to those and how there usually be a person in class who was raising their hand a lot and always seemed to have something to say and wanted to talk about how they were approaching a text or things that they thought when they were reading a text. And she said it's important, even if you're the quieter person in class, that you really put yourself into the shoes of that louder person in wanting to take the interviewer through your thought process. And the reason for that is some of the prompts can be quite heavy. They might be choosing between A and B and different options, and they could be really serious decisions that you're making. And so if you read the prompt and then you're given some time to discuss your reasoning, and you kind of just look up at the ceiling, and then you magically have your answer and say, I'd choose B, that's not really helping them to know what your thought process was. And it might actually be a little bit concerning if you seem to have kind of come to this conclusion without being able to verbalize your reasoning. And so being able to speak through your thought process, even if you're that person who usually is a bit more timid and a bit more quiet in class, it's important to be able to do this. A final note that I have here is to make sure that you answer the prompt either at the beginning of your reasoning and then go through your reasoning, or circle back to it at the end, or do both. But make sure that you're not just simply musing about your understanding of the prompt and you actually give an answer. So if it was to decide between A and B, make sure that you come back and you ultimately do say which one that you would be siding with or choosing. And next, I actually wanted to take a look at a sample prompt. This is not one that I've taken from anybody specifically. It's one that I kind of thought might be a good example, probably a little bit shorter than you might approach on a real interview day. But why don't we look at it together? So I'm going to read it here. You are on your way to class at your university and you come across a student who has collapsed on the sidewalk. What would you do? And so using my approach, read through it, you would think about it for a bit and then give an answer and give some of your reasoning. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about a prompt like this specifically is it's very possible that you could come across a prompt that does include a bit of medical reasoning within it, as this prompt does. But the important thing to remember is that nobody expects you to know what to do or to be a doctor yet and to know how to completely approach the scenario. Nobody expects you to have all of that knowledge yet. Of course, there are some wrong answers or answers that they wouldn't want to hear here. For example, like you would go and try to ignore it and walk away. That wouldn't be somebody who's seeking to help others, which is something that all medical schools are looking for. At the same time, there might not be a clear, correct answer, and that's all right, because when you're in school, you're going to learn all of those life support basics, and you're going to go through trainings, and you'll learn the ABCDs of managing patients who are unstable and approaching them. But for here, the most important part is really to talk through your reasoning of how you would approach the situation. Would you go up and see if the person was responsive? Would you try to go and see if other people were around to ask for help, or to ask for somebody else to call 911? And really to take others into your understanding of the situation and how you might approach something in a stepwise fashion. And so, like I said, it might not be that they're looking for an exact right answer here, because they're probably pretty confident that they can teach you how to approach a situation like this, but to remember not to be flustered and just to talk through what your understanding of the situation is and how you would approach it. Again, I do hope that my videos like this are helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. The most perfect practice for these types of things is really going through and trying to practice on your own, or trying to help with somebody else who can help to query you and maybe ask some follow-up questions as well. If anything doesn't make sense, definitely let me know. And until then, I wish you all the best with interview preparations. Take care.